this video, we are going to analyze the effects of an import quota for a small country. Now remember, a small country is one that has no impact on the world price. As such, right, that export supply curve is a horizontal line. And so we're going to analyze this policy the same way that we did import tariffs. And in fact, you'll see there's a lot of similarities here in terms of the impact on the domestic economy. But there are potentially some differences, and that will depend on how the quota is administered. And so we're going to start off with this scenario, and this is the example from our book. It's the market for bicycles on the left. We have the U.S. market, and here's our domestic equilibrium at the intersection of supply and demand. We can draw that over to our world market, right, or international market, and that's right, where we would draw our import demand curve. The U.S. will take export supply, right, take that price as a given. Export supply curve is just a horizontal line at that world price. So this is our starting point. And here we see, so we've got a price of $300 per bicycle, 1 million bicycles imported into the U.S. every year. Domestic quantity supplied is 600,000. Quantity demand is 1.6 million. That gives us the 1 million in imports. So now let's say that we're going to have a $30, or we're going to have a quota that's going to, in effect, give us an increase in the price of $30. It's important to understand that an import quota can be equivalent to a tariff. And so how do we see that? So this is the quota we're going to put in place here. It would be as if we had a tariff of $30. So instead we're going to say, well, the way we're going to state it is we're going to have an import quota of 600,000 or 0.6 million bicycles. And so when we do that, what do we see? We see that the price, right, the point on the import demand curve at 600,000 equates to a price of 330. Again, I'm not trying to draw anything to scale here, just want to make sure that everything is fairly easy to see. So we could take that price now into our domestic market, right, price of 330, and at those prices, what we would see is that, right, so the price goes up, that means domestic producers are willing to sell more, to produce and sell more, so that comes out to 800,000, right, so quantity supplied increases, the quantity demanded falls, and it's going to fall to 1.4, right, our new quantity of imports is 1.4 minus 8, or 0.6 million, 600,000, as we see in the graph on the right. And so when I said there's an equivalence here, basically, you could get this same outcome, right? With a quota, you pick the amount that you're going to limit the amount of imports, in this case to 600,000, and that pushes the price up to 330. Alternatively, you could set the tariff at $30, right, pushing the price up to 330, and that would give you the same result, that domestic consumers would demand 1.4 million bicycles, domestic producers would supply 800,000, giving us imports of 600,000 or 0.6 million. The question is whether, even if we're talking about an equivalent tariff and quota, whether the welfare effects are the same. So we're going to take a look at this, and again, we're going to use changes in surplus in tariff revenue or quota revenue to analyze the welfare effects. So again, let's start with our consumer. Initially, consumers have a consumer surplus, remember, which is the area below the demand curve down to the price, so that consumer surplus goes all the way down to 300 and out to 1.6 million, this large triangle. Now they're only going to be left with this smaller triangle here. So they are losing A, B, C, and D. Okay? So A is this area to the left of the supply curve, and notice all these areas are between 300 and 330, our two prices. B is this triangle here between 0.6 and 0.8. C is the rectangle between 0.8 and 1.4. And D is this triangle below the demand curve between 1.4 and 1.6. So consumers lose A, B, C, and D, exactly as they would with a tariff of $30, right? So the effect on the consumers is exactly the same. What about our producers? Well, the change in producer surplus, right, is they go from having just this area of surplus, they now gain A. Right? So A is really just a transfer from consumers to producers. Again, exactly as we had with the tariff. Now there's a question of how the tariff is administered. Let's say that what the government does is it just hands out licenses based on just say, well, we'll give it to our favorite importers, okay? So it gives it to U.S. importers. In that case, C would go to the domestic importers, okay? All right, this is the change. In this case, C would be represented as, you could call it the U.S. producers if you wanted to. Another way that they could administer the quota would be to auction the quota rights. And so if they had an efficient auction, then what would happen is that the importers would be willing to pay the equivalent of this area C, right, or up to that amount, to get the quota rents, which is what we're calling that area C. Right? C is our quota rents. With the tariff, that was our tariff revenue. Okay? So in the case of an auction, the government gets C. The net result is we still have a loss of B and D. We still have our production and our consumption distortions. So in the case of the auction, we have exactly the same results as we did with the tariff. However, there are other ways of administering the quota. The government could sit there and administer the quota based on giving favors, or they could have the importers might do what we call rent-seeking activity. Right? And they say, hey, look, we want to get some of that quota rent for ourselves, so they may go out and maybe take the government bureaucrats out for a nice dinner, or they might make some investments and try to say, hey, we need this quota rent because we've made these investments and we are the ones who are best able to, to handle the market. The investments, any kind of these investments that they're making are not the most efficient, so what happens is they end up eroding away part of C. In a worst case scenario, all of C gets dissipated, and then C actually goes into the net loss. Okay? We'll talk a bit more about in class the different ways that the government can administer the quota and how that affects the relative inefficiency of a quota with respect to a tariff. The bottom line is that the tariff is never any worse than a quota. Right? The quota is at best as inefficient as the tariff, but depending on how it is administered, could be even worse than the tariff. Next, we're going to take a look at an import quota, but in the large country case.